And as you will have just heard, I think that this meeting is being recorded. So if by chance you get disconnected or your internet stops behaving, you'll be able to watch the recording later. So that's the first thing I wanted to tell you. And the second is we have enabled the captions. So you may see writing at the bottom of the screen, which is automatically generated captioning. So if you don't just hear it, maybe you'll see it in the captions. So our speaker today is Jayne Poolton Turvey, and she is the very proud daughter of a Dieppe veteran and prisoner of war. She co-authored the best-selling book Destined to Survive, a Dieppe veteran story, with her father, Jack Poolton. That was published in 1998 by Dundurn. For many years, Jayne and her father shared his story with presentations to hundreds of people, specifically students. During this time, she realized the importance of remembering Dieppe and the sacrifices made. Although her father died in 2006, she has continued to tell the Dieppe story and has followed her father's steps throughout Europe. Jayne has won various history awards and is a life member of the Royal Regiment of Canada. Just before I turn it over to Jayne, I'll just direct you to the chat at the bottom of the screen. If throughout you have any questions, Jayne has said she's quite willing to take your questions and comments, so please do put them in the chat. And on that, thank you, Jayne, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This is a subject I'm very passionate about, and you'll see why in a minute. So this is my father's story, but it is also the story of many, many soldiers who participated in the Dieppe raid. There were nearly 2,000 taken prisoner. Around 5,000 Canadians participated in the raid. So even though I'm concentrating on my dad and the Royal Regiment of Canada from Toronto, which was his regiment, basically the story is the same for all of the POWs. So the story of my dad, Jack Poolton, he was born in Toronto, grew up on a farm in Kapuskasing. His life was forever changed after what he experienced in World War II. As I mentioned, this is his story, but also the story of many other Dieppe veterans. He was a soldier, but he was also my dad. I promised Dad I would continue telling the story of the Royals at Dieppe, and that is the book I co-authored with him. So anything you see in quotes is either a quote from my father or a quote from the book. So April 20th, 1940, the day I became a royal, I felt like a somebody that day. They, after some basic training at Borden, they embarked on the RMS Empress of Australia. They thought they were heading for England, but they were given warm clothing and they ended up in Iceland. And they protected Iceland and the Atlantic from German invasion until the end of October, where they traveled then to England. And they were there training in various locations and doing various other maneuvers and training on the Isle of Wight until about July 1942. What I want to bring your attention to, and probably you all that are watching know Dunkirk, D-Day, and Dieppe, but I find people I speak to or have spoken to over my lifetime get the three confused all the time. When the big blockbuster movie came out about Dunkirk a few years ago, I had all kinds of people come up to me saying, "Aren't you excited for the movie on Dieppe?" And I said, "There's a movie on Dieppe? How come I don't know about this?" But it ended up being Dunkirk. So one of the goals of what I do in my project that I'll explain in a minute, and some of the talks I do, is to inform people about the Dieppe raid. So 1942, things are looking pretty grim in Europe. We have this man who's got things happening over there, not so good things. Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, of course, taking over. This is what it would have looked like. Anything in red would have been German occupied territories. The pink color is German allies or dependent states. Things were looking a little grim over there. So, sorry, I'm just going to move one thing off the screen. There we go. So we had to do something. The Canadians had been training since the end of 1940. They wanted to see action. And so July 7th, the raid on Dieppe was being planned under the code name Operation Rudder. The men were assembled, they were put on motherships, they were told to study diagrams of beaches, they were told where they were going, and they were waiting for the weather to cooperate, and it didn't. And then all of a sudden, a couple of German bombers came over and bombed the ships. The one that the Royal Regiment was on, the bomb went straight through, went out the bottom of the hull of the ship without exploding, but there were a couple of sailors killed and a couple of Royals injured. And they decided, the powers that be decided at that point that the Dieppe raid was canceled for all time. So they sent all the men on leave. And, you know, some of the men said that they had mentioned it when they were in pubs, that they were going to go to Dieppe. Many of them also said that because they had been told it was secret, they didn't. But, you know, it was canceled. So why wouldn't they brag about going over and, you know, the possibility of going over? However, no matter what the reason, it was canceled for all time. However, a few weeks later, it was resurrected. The guys were pretty freaked out by this, and it was now scheduled for August 19th, 1942, with a code name Operation Jubilee. This is the last picture of Toronto's Royal Regiment before the Dieppe battle. So they went on to Princess Astrid and the Queen Emma. They were given obsolete aerial photographs. They, the first time for Operation Rudder, they were asked not to bring identification, to take the patches off of their uniforms. But this time they weren't told to do any of that. The Royals were pretty anxious as to why things were a bit different for this one. And you'll see why. There's a comment a little later from my dad saying that they had been sacrificed. You'll see why, because of all of these things that lead up to the actual raid. So while they were on the ship, they were given the opportunity to write a letter home to say goodbye in case they didn't make it. And this Dennis Ambry wrote this letter. I'm not sure if you can read it, but I'll read it. I'll read part of it. Hi, folks. How's things? At last the time has come and I'm feeling pretty good. We are on our way to Dieppe in France to do a spot of damage. This will be my last letter to you folks, but please don't worry. Our time has to come sooner or later, and it's for a good cause. I have not got much time, Mother and Dad. In about 2 hours, we'll be there. Think well of me. I've done my very best. I've written to Bill, and now I want to write to Auntie. They have been swell to me since I came over. Goodbye, Mother, Dad, Dorothy, and everybody. Love to you all, from Denny. And it's almost like he had a premonition he wasn't going to make it, and Private Ambry was killed in action. So the soldiers climbed into landing crafts. Whoops, sorry, I don't know why my words aren't coming up there. They climbed into landing crafts to head for the beach. And you'll see how wide open this landing craft is. With D-Day 2 years later, they changed a lot of things, and that was one of the things they changed, was they adjusted things for the LACs, the landing crafts for D-Day. But these poor guys were out in the open as they were going into the beach. So this is a shot of some of the landing crafts going across the channel. And that's what a landing craft looked like after the raid was done. But you can see if that ramp drops, the guys are open. They're wide open to be shot. So the Dieppe raid, there's various beaches. Not everybody knows that. I, in fact, didn't quite understand it. I had heard it my whole life, but until I went and visualized what the beaches were all about, I had no idea. Puy is the worst beach out of them all to land men on, and that's where the Royal Regiment went in. So this is a quote from Dad's book. Gunfire suddenly erupted to our left. The Royals had to turn in circles for over 20 minutes to avoid detection. We needed the element of surprise and the cover of darkness to penetrate the German defenses and advance inland. Now it appears that we would be landing 20 to 25 minutes late and in full daylight. So these are the companies of the Royal Regiment. The objective was to briefly invade codename Blue Beach and destroy specific gun positions on the headlands between Puy and Dieppe and return to England as quickly as possible. So my dad was with D Company. He landed in the second wave and onto the right side of the beach. A Company landed right in front of a house, and you're going to see a picture of that in a minute. And they landed in the first wave, A and B Company, and they were basically wiped out because they landed right in front of the machine guns. As we landed, we were under a continuous stream of heavy machine gun fire, and as the ramp was dropped, the firing came straight into our landing craft. I heard a voice yell, "Run, Poolton!" As I turned to go to the right, I could see a tank turret that was built into the wall. I threw myself down beside a shallow abutment, hoping it would give me some cover. Dad had 12 high explosive 2-inch mortar bombs in his backpack. And I don't know if you can see this, but that, whoops, gotta go this way. That's what the mortar bombs look like. So and they're pretty heavy. So he was carrying 12 of those, but they were high explosives. As the smoke screen was clearing, I emerged aghast at the carnage before me, and I knew I had landed in hell. The rocks were multiplying the shrapnel, just showers of it. So our last trip over in 2017, one of the guys on the trip is a bit of a rock hound, I guess you'd call him. He took a rock up off the beach and he pounded the side of it with another rock. And that's what came off. And that was what was flying at these men. Some of them lost eyes to this. Some of them were wounded in various other places from the rocks. The rocks were treacherous. And believe me, if you've never been there, I've been there 3 times, you can't walk on the rocks, let alone run on the rocks when you're being fired at. It was heart-wrenching to see the blue patch of the 2nd Division, which we were all so proud of, ripped, torn, and stained with blood. So this is a shot of the beach. So you have to realize the tide goes out, the tide comes in. So the first one here at the top, the tide is basically in, but the pier had a machine gun on it. You can see from the bottom right here, that's the White House. That was, there was a bunker. You'll see pictures of it in a minute. You can actually go in there with permission from the man who owns the house. And there were pillboxes and as my dad said, a tank turret built right into the cliffs. So the crossfire was like unbelievable. There was nowhere to go for cover. It was just horrendous. That's the height of the cliffs. There's a man standing beside the cliffs, and that is basically a wide open beach. Concrete pillboxes made it extremely hard for the Royals to shoot back at the enemy. They literally couldn't see the enemy as they were behind this protective concrete, Hitler's Atlantic Wall. So this is one of those pillboxes that has now fallen off the cliff. And you can see how thick this concrete is. They didn't just do this overnight. This was, you know, months and months of planning, or maybe years of planning to get this all in place. So this is that German bunker that's up by the house. You can see it's like a home. The gentleman down on the left-hand side in the gray is a French colonel who owns the house, and he was thrilled to have descendants of these royals that had landed at Puy up at his house. So he let us go and explore. He uses the bunker as a shed, but you'll see on the right-hand side, this was a sniper or a machine gun nest. You could call it a nest, I guess. And at the bottom right, that's me sticking my head up out of it. And look at the view they had of the beach. And there's the White House. So this is an artist's painting of the confusion on the beach that day. I just can't imagine. It just blows my mind that anyone survived and that my dad walked off that beach with not a wound. The tide was coming in and drowning the wounded. After 3 orders to surrender, in order to try and save some of the badly wounded, the officers finally surrendered. "554 soldiers from the Royal Regiment of Canada landed on Blue Beach. 229 Royals were killed in action, died from wounds, died as POWs, or died shortly after repatriation." "264 Royals were captured and became prisoners of war, including my dad. Only 65 were evacuated to England. Most of them were wounded. Some of the wounded were treated in Dieppe. The badly wounded were sent to Rouen, where they were treated and then sent to POW camps. My dad always said they had been sacrificed. The Germans knew they were coming. They were told by certain Germans they had been waiting for 2 weeks. What took you so long? My dad said you can train a soldier to fight and you can train a soldier to accept death, but there is no way to prepare a soldier to be taken prisoner. The experience can only be understood by one who has been through the humiliation. Dieppe raid, Canada's darkest day of World War II. At the end of the day, casualties were 907 killed, 586 wounded, 1,946 taken prisoner. The Royal Regiment of Canada suffered the heaviest casualties of all the participating units. Nearly 500 families received telegrams informing them that their royal was missing in action, presumed dead. So after they were rounded up, they were taken to a school courtyard where I actually don't have a photo of it in this presentation, but one of our Allied aircraft didn't know that they were Canadians and shot at them. But the first night they were taken to this unfinished factory at St. Nicholas, and we visited there in 2017. The mayor of St. Nicholas actually laid a wreath for us and gave us a reception. But my dad, the first day we started working on his book, he talked about that first night and how traumatic it was. They had been in salt water, he hadn't had a drink, and they had one tap for nearly 2,000 POWs. So some of the guys didn't get a drink. So Dad said that first night will remain in my mind forever. Dying of thirst, I had scraped a hole in the dirt floor and pressed my tongue and parched lips to the damp earth. And that's the POWs before they were put into the factory for the night. And then they were taken to Invermeux, which is just a few kilometers from St. Nicholas, and put into train cars. They ended up in a place called Verneuil, and they were there for a week. They were questioned by the Germans and whatever else happened. I'm not 100% sure. I'm still researching that. But then they were put into these cars, 50 men to a car. There was no room to lie down, so we either had to stand or squat. We were given a round loaf of black bread about 10 inches in diameter, as well as another sixth of a loaf. The bread was to last us 5 days, although we did not know that at the time. There was a bucket in the middle that was to be used as a latrine. There were wounded in with us, and by the time we arrived in Germany, their wounds had become badly infected. And then they came to this train siding where it was very close, about 1 kilometer from the camp. The first thing my dad saw when he exited the train car was Russian POWs who were dressed in rags, and the Germans were using bullwhips on them. And my dad in his head said, if they're going to do that to me, they're going to have to shoot me before they'll use a bullwhip on me. The thing was, the Russians were not part of the Geneva Convention, and so they were treated really badly. And their camp was across the road from the camp that my dad was about to be in. My dad was put into Stalag 8B. So this is the road. I visited the camp in 2010. The camp is no longer there. There's a museum, but this is a group of British people on the tour, and their fathers were all in the camp as well. The men were formed into columns for the mile-long march to the prison camp. We marched down a road lined with cherry trees. Although we were weak with hunger, we had been warned by the guards that we would be shot for picking any of the cherries. So in defiance, when I was there, I picked a cherry off the tree and brought it home. We were stopped outside the gates for searches, registration, and counting. We were then photographed, fingerprinted, and issued a disc with our Kriegsgefangene number. I was given disc number 26212. So we're standing on the same spot as where the gate would have been. And this woman in the red, her father was actually a buddy of my dad's from the Royal Regiment, and he was in the camp as well. Stalag 8B, Lambsdorff. Very little food, very little water, infestations, cruelty, loneliness, boredom, cold, humiliation, punishment, forced work, disease, uncertain future, and nearly 3 years away from family. This picture here of this model is the Canadian compound. The Dieppe Canadians were kept separate because they thought they were a threat. And you can't really see it from here, but right by the guard tower is hut 19B. And during the chain up, which you're about to find out about, they dug an escape tunnel under 19B. It was discovered, unfortunately, but it's pretty incredible. Some of the royals who were from Timmins and who had worked in the gold mines up there and the other mines that were up there knew how to dig tunnels and mines. So they were down there, you know, day after day after day digging, and they actually got across the road and had an exit door, but it obviously was discovered. So this is a picture of the hut. My dad, the people in the hut, not the hut, the soldiers who were in the hut, and my dad is circled. It was a propaganda photo. They gave them a shower that day and got them all cleaned up and took these photos. So that's why my dad's got his arms crossed in defiance, because he's like, wait a minute, we're not being treated all that nicely, and you're making it look like we are. So Dieppe Canadians, I can't get into the reason. There's a lot of theories. The main reason my dad always said was that at Dieppe, there were a few Germans taken prisoner, and they had their hands tied and they threw themselves overboard and drowned and washed up. And Hitler wanted Churchill to apologize. I've heard other reasons too, which we'd be here all day if I told you all these reasons, but that's what my dad always thought. But they tied their wrists first in front of them with rope, and the rope was causing sores. So then they brought in these chains, and they were shackled and roped for 410 days total. put on in the morning, taken off at night. My dad said there was about 15 inches of chain with a swivel in the middle, and they could get them off with a key from the meat, the sardine tins. They discovered they could get them off, but if they were caught with them off, they were made to stand nose and toes to a wall for hours and hours. So they didn't like to get caught with them off. And then came the death march. So January 22nd, 1945, my dad was told to get any of his belongings. He didn't have very much because they were being marched out of the camp. The Allies were coming, closely to this camp. And I'm not 100% sure of the reason why all the prisoners of war were made to march on these marches. But the Russians showed up not that much longer after this, and the Germans didn't like the Russian army. So that could have been the reason for Lambsdorff. But my dad grew up in Kapuskasing, so he knew how to deal with cold and freezing cold temperatures and snow. So he was able to survive. Some of the men from warmer climates, he tried to help them. Some of them ended up with frostbite, having their hands amputated. It was just a horror show from the beginning to the end. I followed the route. My dad marked it on a map when he got home so he wouldn't forget. And in 2010, we arranged with the tour guide to have a small van. Myself, my brother, and my daughter took this tour on the back roads following the 1,500 kilometers that he walked between January 22nd and April 12th. He said it was hard to pick out the dead from the living. He didn't turn around to have a last look at the camp. The weather was below zero and there were banks of snow up to 4 feet high along the side of the road. We passed many men who had frozen to death the day before. To fall by the wayside, you would be shot. They were also strafed by Allied airplanes as they staggered along the road. They didn't know they were POWs, obviously. The ones who survived had to throw themselves into the ditch to avoid the planes. About mid-afternoon on April 11th, 1945, they entered the town of Dittfurt, Germany. The Germans told us we would receive no bread as Allied planes had strafed the town that day. We had eaten nothing for 4 days. This town of Dittfurt is absolutely gorgeous. We walked the last kilometer into this town. It's a very, very old town and it's absolutely beautiful, but I can't imagine my father would have thought that in 1945. I was awakened on the morning of the 12th at about 6 a.m. by a rooster crowing. Harry, so there were 2 South African brothers, Harry and I can't remember the other man's name right now. My dad helped Harry drag his brother because his brother was in really bad shape. So he literally helped Harry drag his brother and they both survived. So Harry was shouting from the barnyard, "There's a Jeep out there, there's a Jeep out there." I got to my feet, ran through, and there almost in the center of Germany was a Jeep and 3 American soldiers. I saw 3 angels that morning. It was like coming back from the dead. We were liberated. I will never forget that day. So this is the actual building where they were. We didn't know it at the time. I've since found out later on. It is a museum, but it's a museum to agriculture in the area. But I did go inside because I asked to use the washroom so I could snoop and look around. I wish I would have known at the time that that was the barnyard. Like the building, obviously the barnyard isn't there anymore. But at the time, our language barrier was really bad. So, but luckily I took some photos, so that was a good thing. I stood there staring at the white star on the hood, almost afraid that it was an illusion, and if I looked away, it would disappear. The white star symbolized to me goodness and decency, quite a contrast to the evil that surrounded us. My dad weighed roughly 80 pounds when he was liberated.
A sailor said to me, "You know where we're headed?" He said, "We're headed to Dieppe." It was pitch black, and we walked through the ship in silence, in the dark, holding onto the bayonet scabbard of the man ahead to the landing craft. The Germans fired flares, but it lit up the channel, you know, and you could see the escort vessels and all these little landing craft. These mortars were coming all up the beach, and the stones were multiplying the shrapnel. It was just showers of this stuff. The one that landed, I tilted my helmet and turned my eyes away because I was worried about my eyes. And this sniper hit the brim of my helmet and knocked my helmet off. This signalman was sitting in the destroyer. Fire a couple of shells in, hit the wall, knock a hole in the wall, do anything. Fire shells in. Never mind the men. If you kill us guys, that's fine. Nothing. I weighed 80 pounds when the American 9th Army liberated me on the 12th of April, 1945. I ran out, and here's the Jeep with these three American troops, driver, radio operator. And I spoke to the officer, I saluted. Other men were coming out, and the hood, men's tears were leaving little trails on the hood of the Jeep. I arrived in England on the 27th of April, and they hospitalized us. I called it paradise, the one Canadian General Hospital. And after we'd been through anything, a crust of bread on the street was worthwhile, was worthy. It was all the joyfulness of the war ending. I was in London the night before VE Day with my brother Alan. I couldn't rejoice. I couldn't rejoice. I wanted to see these people rejoicing.
A message from the Government of Canada.
So this is my dad being interviewed before a trip over to Dieppe. He's in Ottawa at this point. They didn't get any help for PTSD, which wasn't recognized back then. These men suffered in silence for the rest of their lives. Flashbacks, nightmares, anger issues, alcoholism, suicide, abusive family members. They advocated for years for pensions and for the right to wear the France and Germany Star Medal. They never got the permission to wear it. So the Dieppe raid, rocks on the beach, huge cliffs, no softening up of the enemy, studied obsolete aerial photos, aerial reconnaissance, failed to notice underwater minefield, Atlantic wall was already built, series of mistakes happened, second and third wave, and not realizing that the first wave had been nearly wiped out, canceled Operation Rudder, told Dieppe raid canceled for all time, then resurrected it. Germans were aware they were coming, according to several sources. Tanks on Main Beach were useless on the rocks. Element of surprise, this was lost. Communication between beach and commanders failed. Dieppe planning was based on the mistaken belief that fewer than 2,000 Germans manned the shore defenses. In fact, there were close to 6,500 experienced troops. And it was the first combined operations, which meant Army, Navy, Air Force worked together. Was the Dieppe raid supposed to fail? No recognition, Dieppe was considered a failure. As I mentioned, we're not given the France and Germany Star. After 50 years of the Dieppe Veterans Association petitioning to wear the medal, they struck a Dieppe bar, and not all of them were able to get it because they had already passed away. So because of how I, saw my dad, his emotions, his guilt at surviving, writing the book with him, going countless times to schools and community groups and listening to him. In, well, almost 6 years ago, November 11th, I created a project called the Dieppe Blue Beach Every Man Remembered Project. So the idea is to find a photo and a bio of all 554 Royals who landed at Blue Beach. It's been the most incredible thing I've ever done. I'm not quite finished, but it will be put together in a commemorative book. We do events. These are frames with our fallen. We did one event. We have a lot more photos now. But we go to schools, we put together a remembrance event at the Aurelia Library where I work. We have events down at Fort York Armories before COVID happened to tell the story and make sure these men are not forgotten. So some of these stories I've found since I've started, these two brothers, Arthur and Ralph Montgomery, were both killed, twin brothers killed on the beach. I just can't even fathom getting the word that both of my twin sons, as well as Mason and Thomas Williamson, both were killed on the beach. Private Gittins, Private Painter, and Private Williams came over as British home children. They worked in the Uxbridge area on farms. They kept in touch. I was in touch with the gentleman whose family owned the farm that Robert Gittins worked on. He was treated as a member of the family. He got off lucky, but they all kept in touch. They all went down to Fort York Armory and enlisted with the Royal Regiment of Canada, and they were all killed on the beach on the same day. 4 sons joined up together. Raymond was killed. Douglas was a POW. John returned. Alan was injured and didn't end up going, but 4 sons over there fighting for our freedom. But there are also some good stories. This is Des Halloran, who was a prisoner of war. He ended up making an escape attempt and was recaptured and put into a different camp than he had been in previously before his escape. And he was put into solitary confinement, but they were allowed to have a walk once a day in the courtyard. And so he was not having a very good time. The conditions were horrible. He was being treated horribly. And there were some Americans in the courtyard, and he walked around the courtyard with these Americans. They weren't allowed to speak, but they could whisper every once in a while. And he said, if I get out of this alive, I'm going somewhere beautiful and warm. And one of the Americans said to him, go to Hawaii. So Des got home, he survived, he went to Hawaii, he opened a nightclub, and he ended up having huge stars appear in his nightclub. He had Elvis, Carol Burnett, Jack Benny, all the old school performers. They all performed at his nightclub. And that's a good news story. And then Roy Jacks, again, he was in the prison camp, a different one. He was actually a British soldier who got into trouble. One night he went AWOL and did some things he shouldn't have. So he ended up in the Royal Regiment, landed at Dieppe, and he came back and became a pretty famous journalist. And for those of you who are old enough to remember a show called Magistrate's Court, probably one of the first judge shows. I remember it came on after the Flintstones around 12:30 when I was eating my lunch when I came home from school. And he was the magistrate. So why did the Dieppe raid happen? Valuable lessons that help with the invasion 2 years later, to test German defenses, to prove that an invasion was not possible in 1942. They felt that a large raid on the coast of France could force the Germans to divert more of their military resources away from the Soviet Union, and also help in the planning for the full-scale Allied assault that would eventually have to take place. There was political pressure at home to finally get the Canadians into battle. 1942 was one of the darkest periods of the Second World War, but the fact that the Allies had come ashore and occupied France gave the French people some hope, and the Dieppe raid let them know they hadn't been forgotten. And then there's David O'Keefe's theory of recovering in a German Enigma machine held in German naval headquarters in Dieppe. If you haven't read the book One Day in August by David O'Keefe or seen the documentary Dieppe Uncovered, I highly recommend it. I can't get into that or we'd be here all day. It's an incredible find that David made in the British archives, and some of you might already be aware of it. So we have a website and a Facebook page. If you happen to know of anyone who might be connected to the men we're trying to find photos and bios for, please get in touch. We find these people in the strangest of places, people that don't even know their grandparent or great-grandparent was there. There was a family in the US I found who was always told that their grandfather was killed in the South Pacific with the US Marines, when in fact he was a Royal Regiment of Canada soldier from Britain originally and was killed in the Dieppe raid on Blue Beach. So thank you so much. I would welcome questions or comments if anybody has them. There's one in. Oh, hi, Tish. One of our audience members has been helping me track down some of our families, which is great. I really appreciate your help, Tish.
I have a question for you.
Okay.
A lot of people that I've read about or have known that were involved in the war were very reluctant to talk about it. Why do you think your dad was different and so willing to share his story?
He wasn't for many years. I came along a lot later. My brother and sister are a lot older than me. So when I was around the house, he was, mellowing a little bit. And he started talking, not the horror stories, but funny stories. And we just kept encouraging him that he had to get this down on paper. And eventually he agreed. But it took us 5 years to write that book because he had to keep stopping. And we'd be in the middle of, I typed, he spoke, I typed, and then I edited afterwards. But there'd be times when he would just get up, take his papers, and not say a word and leave. And I was like, what did I do? Like, did I say something to offend him? I didn't really understand until we had finished it all. And what I'm finding from the families I'm getting in touch with through the project is that 9 out of 10 of them, their dads or grandfathers never spoke. And some of them didn't even know their family member had been a prisoner of war. They're like shocked. They knew he'd been in the war. But the project is actually healing families too, because some of them have really bad feelings towards their fathers because of what they went through, and learning the story has helped them let it go. So that wasn't the purpose of the project in the first place, but that's what's happened, and it's been incredible. Anybody else? Oh, somebody, Terry Butler is saying I'm not sure if it's a he or she, I apologize for that, can't unmute, and looking for contact info. So my email address for the project is diepbluebeach@gmail.com. That's sort of easy to remember, I hope.
Yo, can you hear me?
I can. Hi.
Outstanding presentation. I'm sorry, I didn't get the contact information, and why I want it is I'm part of the Quinte branch of OGS that
Oh,
do presentations on a regular basis,
yeah.
and I want to get our person who looks after presentations to contact you,
Oh,
because
absolutely.
just you can send me an email if you wish, or vice versa.
Okay, well, I'll mention it again. So my email is diepbluebeach@gmail.com.
Yep, bluebeach@gmail.com.
.com.
Oh, outstanding. Oh, and I also
so much.
triggered on the prisoner of war camp that you mentioned, the Stalag 8B.
Mhm.
My uncle was, well, he was a guest for 3 years.
Oh,
He
great.
made 1.5, no, I think 1.5, 2.5 trips over Germany.
Oh, wow.
About 1942, and I guess he had hotel reservations for 3 years. And I think, I have to double check, but I think it was the same camp, because like a lot of POWs, they were, when they finally got home, they didn't talk about it for years,
No.
years. And like I'm saying, 50 years afterwards, almost, quite, well, not quite, he's now deceased, but he, the way he described the camp, they were how do I put it? They were, the camp was overtaken by the Russian army,
Mhm.
and they had to evacuate. And there's too many coincidences here that maybe there were other POWs there, of course, but I wonder if he was
Well, I have
mutually there.
I have a list of the Canadian POWs. So why, if you email me, give me his name and I'll look him up and see if he's in that book.
Well,
And
his
you'll know for
spelling
sure.
of his last name is rather interesting. It's the double T Butler.
Oh, okay.
His first name was Lance.
I'll have a look.
But we'll do some email exchanges and look at that. I've got his some of the shoot down information, a lot of other stuff, and I
Yeah.
haven't compared the camp numbers exactly, but it was on the eastern side of Germany, and it was in fact released or overtaken by the Russians, and they had a Russian camp on the other, like part of that camp. So what you're describing matches absolutely 100% to what he was saying.
Yeah, no, it was a huge camp. There were a lot of flyers in the camp, and they divided them up into, like the RAF compound.
Yep.
There were CAF in there as well. So chances are it was Lambsdorff. So yeah, and the Canadians, one thing I found out that I was really proud of, my dad talked about it, but when I went to the museum, they talked about it as well. The Russians, they could see the Russians on the other side of the road. And our guys, as much as they were starving and didn't have, back then cigarettes were a big deal, they were trying to throw things at the Russians across the road.
Yep.
And occasionally it would get to them. And then the Russian would be like overwhelmed with gratitude, but sometimes it would fall short of the fence. And, it made me feel really proud as a Canadian that they would do that when they were starving, but they were getting Red Cross parcels, whereas the Russians weren't.
Yeah.
And, the conditions on the other side were horrendous. They had typhoid in there. So as bad as it was for our guys, it was even worse for the guys across the road.
Did your father ever keep a Red Cross, I'm going to say a scrapbook?
POW logbook?
Well, logbook, whatever. What I'm referencing to is my uncle had a Red Cross scrapbook that he noted down. The guys do drawings in it and that kind of stuff.
Does it look like this?
You know, I don't know. I've seen it once, and then my cousins, who had several,
His children.
his children and my cousins, they had kids, and the kids took it to show and tell at school. And quite frankly, after I saw it once, I've never seen it again. I've been trying to find it. It's lost in somewhere along the line. So just to digitize the thing and see it. But the time that I did see it, they had sketches of the camp. They had pictures that the guys had drawn, names of individuals in there. It's a real keepsake that, unfortunately, in my case, seems to have disappeared.
Yeah, exactly. That's probably what you're talking about. My dad had to pull most of the insides out on the death march because it was so heavy, but there's quite a bit left of it, thank goodness. But yeah. And
Wow.
I've seen some pretty amazing ones since I started the project. Some families scan them and send them to me. I've seen some in person that are just, the drawings are just unbelievable. Like the artists that were in the camp that could do these drawings. So pretty impressive. Yeah.
All the above. Well, thank you very much for your presentation, and I'm hopeful that I can resurrect this again.
No worries. Just get
Thank
in
you.
touch. Anyone else have any comments or questions?
Well, thank you very much. And I meant to say thank you to the Memory Project as well. That's the organization that connected us with Jayne here at the library. So thank you to them, and also to Jayne. I see Joe has a hand up.
Oh.
I don't know if that indicates a question. And if so, maybe Joe, you could put it in the chat. And if not, maybe that's just a clap. I'm not sure.
There. There. Now was it unmuted?
Yes.
Oh, okay, because before it said you couldn't unmute. I just wanted to say it was a great presentation. Thank you very much for doing it. But I missed the name of the book that your dad and you wrote. Could you say the name again, please?
Yes, I don't think I actually said the name, to be quite honest with you. It's called Destined to Survive.
Destined to Survive. Oh, okay, thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Well, thank you so much for listening. And like I said, it's a passion of mine to tell the story. So I appreciate you being here and listening.
Good. Thank you. And thanks everybody for coming.